American Pickers was more than simply an antique hunting reality show. Represented the bond and camaraderie of three extremely different people: Mike Wolfe, the founder; Frank Fritz, his long-standing best friend and reliable companion, is the driving force; and Danielle Colby, an astute multi-skilled individual who oversaw the backstage operations and maintained their genuineness and groundedness, which kept the group's spirit alive. Energy that made the concert special and created a sentimental connection with millions of viewers in America and other countries. However, nothing endures long, as Frank abruptly left the show in 2020, left the fan base in a state of uncertainty and conjecture. Personal disputes, health problems, conflicts of interest, and even treason broke out, but when one of the parties spoke up, the long quiet simply served to heighten the drama. It wasn't until lately that Mike Wolfe sparked an extraordinary public controversy. And Danielle Colby showed up out of the blue during a public court hearing concerning Frank Fritz, who suffered a serious stroke and is currently under care. The truth gradually came to light, so let's find out what was revealed. The entire narrative in today's video. On that particular day, the courtroom experience wasn't vast, yet millions of followers' gazes appeared to focus on a single historic scene of lawyers holding legal notes in rows of orderly chairs. Given an emotionally charged atmosphere, this was not your typical hearing. There were no heated arguments or outbursts between the parties, but rather making space and quiet for meaningful words that have been suppressed for years. Mike Wolfe's gray outfit only served to highlight his height as he entered, his face, clearly exhausted. Thin body appeared heavier next to him, and Danielle Colby, who is usually piercing and previously vivacious, she was suddenly unusually calm, with her hair styled and cosmetics applied. Subtle, but she had red-rimmed eyes, and they didn't say anything to each other. Their combined presence was more significant than any formal declaration they had ever made. For a little while, the only sound heard was the turning of pages by the room was filled with the judge and the courtroom's anxious gaze, yet everyone understood that what was going to be stated was the public's tale, not just a legal formality. Had been waiting for 3 years to learn that this was not a property or personal case. Argument, this was a hearing on the matter, not your average media controversy. Supervision of Frank Fritz, who had been Mike's friend for almost 2. Frank was not on national television for decades after having a stroke in 2022. He was unable to take care of himself and now lived alone, relying on someone to make financial and medical choices made on his behalf. In the court filings, the names Danielle and Mike showed up as people who were closely related to Frank's life and present circumstances. They weren't plaintiffs or defendants. We're just 2 folks who were troubled by regret and came out to say something that they might have ought to have spoken a long time ago. Frank's attorney did not object to their attendance. On the contrary, it was thought to be essential to elucidating the extent of their interaction with him. A significant consideration in the court's judgment about Frank's future caretakers. Neither Mike nor Danielle talked at first. Mike's initial remarks were not loud but unambiguous and determined. "I'm here to apologize, not to defend myself," he said. Remarked, his voice shaking a little, but his eyes remained fixed on Danielle, who nodded and clasped her. The atmosphere in the courtroom increased as she gripped her hands hard, seemingly to ground herself against the wave of emotion. If all sounds had been sucked into a vast emptiness, the click of everyone was watching, not a legal recorder, and they didn't care about protocol. Process but a public reconciliation of those who were formerly considered relatives. Nielsen data shows that American Pickers attracted more than 3 million viewers each episode at its height in 2011 to 2014. That figure demonstrated how this 3 was previously influential, but they were reunited off-screen. However, in a place where no one ever wanted a courtroom, there were no harsh interrogations with only a judge who listened and occasionally nodded slowly. She realized that this was a necessary space rather than a punitive hearing for those involved in confronting oneself and a friend who was unable to communicate. This is where the narrative started, and viewers who previously thought they was familiar with this trio and would hear everything once more, this time from the individuals themselves, uncut, unscripted, and completely the admittance of human Mike Wolfe. Mike Wolfe no longer looked like the tough guy who stood at the witness stand. previously traveled throughout the nation looking for gems stashed away in abandoned garages, and that day, he stood there as a broken friend, a man who had missed his opportunity to preserve a friendship, but more significantly, he was a human being. Removing the celebrity armor to expose what had been hidden inside, I need to have contacted Frank. Mike, he spoke gently at first, but his rich, recognizable voice now held a choke. I should have called him, have made sure he was all right, but I didn't. That admission reverberated not just through the courtroom, but also in the thoughts of everyone who had followed them since the beginning of the play. Mike and Frank had appeared in almost 300 episodes of American Pickers. Chemistry that was so strong that they appeared to read each other's ideas, but audiences were never aware of the tightening pressure behind the scenes. Filming schedules, network requirements, and the burdensome responsibility of upholding a mic, a well-known television brand, didn't back down from this. On the contrary, he acknowledged that he had become detached from reality due to the show's enormous success. I let my job and profession to take precedence over my connection with Frank. Members in the audience nodded, not necessarily in agreement but rather in acknowledgement of a universal truth. A lot of people have overlooked crucial details in pursuit of what appeared to be an urgent matter. When Frank abruptly departed the show and without saying goodbye, fans realized right away that 2020 will never be the same. Explained, and after a few episodes, Mike kept showing up on TV by himself. Social media was flooded with fans asking where Frank was and what. Instead of responding to Mike, did Frank and Mike have a falling out? Decided to remain silent, and in court, he gave me an explanation for why I believed it would be okay that we'd speak once more, that everything would return to normal, but I was mistaken and allowed. He looked about as the silence continued, deepening the crack. His gaze paused in the courtroom at a vacant chair that was set aside for Frank. I believed I had time because he was well enough to go, but none of us have as much. As we believe Mike stated, it was a warning as well as a confession, but Mike didn't stop at self-blame. He publicly recognized for the first time the deeper. He did not avoid using the word conflict when discussing the reasons for the break. There were disagreements between Frank and me in the way we collaborated on the show's direction, and in many personal issues. We eventually lost the ability to converse as we once did. And I was unsure of how to close that gap. Frank had expressed his own annoyance, and The Sun stated in a brief 2021 interview that he felt abandoned, but I haven't heard anything Mike said. Not even that line, left fans scarred to this day. Mike verified its veracity and provided no justifications for my failure. I was just too busy. I continued to believe that I could call at any time, not understanding that the opportunity would eventually come. These were reflections rather than words of explanation. Of a man facing himself in front of a friend and the public who couldn't. At one point throughout the hearing, Mike looked up rather than at the longer response. Neither the audience nor the judge, but in some invisible realm, Frank was more than simply a coworker. He was a friend from my childhood. Someone who accompanied me through a lot. Lost his voice, therefore I didn't give him a call. And I'm hoping that he hears me, media consultant, because here is the only place I can say this in front of everyone. Todd Harris, who has provided crisis advice to many TV celebrities, remarked on Mike's assertion that it's uncommon for public figures to own up to their mistakes so honestly, without placing blame on the situation or other people. Mike Wolfe's actions were therapeutic, not just for Frank if he can still understand it, but for the viewers who used to adore them, family. Mike stressed in his parting words that this was not the end. I don't expect Frank to comprehend everything, and I don't expect the public to forgive me immediately, but I must state this because the stillness that followed Mike's resignation from the chamber fell silent once more, but this time it was different. Silence is not a sign of stress but rather of introspection and the dawn of reality. If Mike Wolfe was the one who did it, Danielle Colby would have been the one in the center and the silent sufferer. Entered the public eye and came under examination, Danielle KBY was the one who appeared after standing in the shadows for 3 long years. In every long-running television series, characters are caught in conflict and burdened with guilt. Some supporting characters turn into quiet pillars, and Danielle was one of them. Precisely because, unlike Mike and Frank, she didn't drive the American freeways. However, she served as the anchor behind the scenes, handling the calls. Agreements, frequently the highly heated discussions, and specifically because she being situated in the middle, Danielle was better able to comprehend the rifts that were developing among the group when she didn't wear the glitzy performance attire that was customary for her burlesque performances when she appeared in court. When she wore vintage clothing, she dressed simply and subtly, perhaps to get everyone's notice. Was concentrated on Frank, the close friend who was the most important thing. Danielle remarked, her voice shaking, "I should have done more. I had been her comrade in arms for almost 15 years. Determined, I stood in the midst of them and watched them evolve as the distance increased. And I assumed that everything would be all right since I expected they would speak again, but they didn't and I took no action either." Yet her confession moved me not because it disclosed a little-known fact, but because it was an honest admission of the powerlessness experienced by someone witnessing a friendship fall apart during Frank's. Danielle attempted to maintain objectivity on her own Instagram when she was not on the show. Account with over 200,000 followers, she never made any posts that took sides or defend anyone, but close sources claim Danielle had made several attempts to re-establish contact between the two guys by texts, emails, and even indirect messages via "it didn't work with shared friends," and at times I felt like a kid in a. Danielle claimed that in a home where the parents had stopped communicating, I didn't want to take sides, but I also couldn't ignore it, so I looked away. And I regret that I ultimately decided to keep quiet because it was obvious that her fear of making matters worse was the reason behind her quiet, not a lack of interest. She decided to avoid the situation since she was afraid of being misinterpreted and of losing both men at once. Despite her inner knowledge that it just increased the media's distancing as she went on, there was long-standing conjecture that Danielle had sided with Mike. Appearing in subsequent seasons, but she denied that in court today. Presumption that I never took a side and instead stood for the recollections of a period when at that moment, the three of us were a family and a team. She took out a folded piece of paper to grasp as a comforting object rather than read. "I miss Frank. In the office, we used to have lunch together after arguing and laughing. But since Frank, I am unable to call him and inform him of them. Was put under medical observation after suffering a stroke in July 2022. According to the Quad City Times, guardianship and all communication with him have been essentially cut off. Incurred harm to the parts of his brain in charge of motor abilities and Danielle's memory is seriously affecting his cognitive ability. Few people are allowed to visit, but even those visits are infrequent and not always." Frank first notices her in a quick social media post in 2023, Danielle posted a 30-second video of her eyes reading while she sat in her automobile. "Even if I didn't want to film, I have to admit that I miss Frank and I hope could return to their former state." The video received more than 1 million views. Just a day, demonstrating how much the audience is still interested in this friendship, she made it clear in court that working with Mike did not imply that she had choose him over Frank, but sometimes we have to move on as life doesn't wait. Does not imply that I have forgotten someone. This straightforward statement struck a chord with many people who have encountered the same predicament where two individuals who are both very important to not totally at fault from a social psychology standpoint. Dr. Laura Gibson, a psychologist from the University of Chicago, observed that Danielle embodies the idea of the emotionally charged role of the imprisoned middleman. Strained and frequently misinterpreted, she carried the emotional weight despite having little decision-making authority. Accountability on both parties, which can result in ongoing guilt even when there isn't. When there was clear misconduct, Danielle didn't cry in court, but her eyes expressed more than any tears could, and her voice became softer as she talked about Frank. "Frank may still be able to hear, but if he is, I just want him to. I apologize for not being strong enough to keep the three of us together at that particular moment, but know that I always think about him." The courtroom broke out in tears, and it wasn't because of huge words, but sometimes in life you don't need them because of a straightforward, terrible reality. Silence is all it takes to betray someone and cause them pain, and you've unintentionally produced a fracture that isn't restored the unknown backstory outside the tiny screen, where viewers could only witness happy moments, clever banter, and quietly negotiating an alternative truth about antiques revealed a truth with no editing, more stillness, and fewer giggles, according to In Court. Mike and Danielle both acknowledged their connection with there was no backstage scandal, and Frank didn't disintegrate because of any one incident. No violent altercation, no treachery as the media had suggested, nothing disintegrated much more stealthily, so slowly that nobody noticed until it was too late. Late, I can't remember the day because there wasn't a distinct moment, Mike claimed that everything happened gradually, with fewer calls and fewer chats. Got shorter and the quiet seemed to last longer after each journey. Actually, the first indications that a link was waning were minor adjustments. According to experts in creative collaborations, such as Yale University professor Linda Hemmings, there is a long-term silent erosion is a phenomena connections when there aren't any significant disputes but a tie becomes weaker because individual adjustments are not reciprocated. This seems to as it happened with Mike and Frank. Mike grew more and more preoccupied with production expansions, arranging large-scale events, and licensing the American Pickers name to consumer goods conversely. Antique shows Frank continued to be based on a more straightforward way of life that was centered on treasure hunting. Frank disliked change and appeared uninterested in business endeavors. Danielle stated in court that he preferred the vehicle and workflow to remain unchanged. Mike, on the other hand, was constantly anticipating the future, even in his morning coffee ritual. Considering more broadly, what began as a stylistic difference gradually evolved into a Frank's health started to deteriorate in 2018, therefore he had to take several. Mike continued filming while taking weeks off for spinal therapy, which led some viewers to assume that Frank was purposefully phased out of the show, although no formal declarations were made at the time. Court records show that I recall that when Frank returned, it was the first time he felt replaced. Surgery, we continued to film, and I assumed he would be alright, but I never questioned him directly if he felt abandoned, as I now realize I ought to have done. Mike stated that a member of the production crew that year had their eyes cast downward. Closest to Frank was swapped out, and the sense of losing his network of support deepened. A crew member asked anonymity revealed that Frank frequently sat by himself in between takes, ceasing to interact. He used to be the group's biggest storyteller during lively conversations, but he had hardly spoken in recent years, and Danielle had also noticed the difference. I mentioned to Mike that Frank appeared to be withdrawing, but everyone believed that complacency was only a stage and that it was the beginning of after a string of lost opportunities. 2020 filming was interrupted due to the COVID-19 epidemic, and everyone went back to their respective. There were no calls or messages in households during the roughly 8-month lull that ensued. I'm not sure why Mike said, maybe I thought Frank was, between him and Frank, irate or that he required space. However, I was mistaken, and neither was Frank. Returned with no social media posts, no official farewell, and no announcement. Following the media's coverage of his stroke in 2021, Mike and long before the sickness ever struck, Danielle felt they had lost their friend. Shocked, I discovered I hadn't heard of Frank in almost 2 years, and that's awful, it's awful, Mike exclaimed, his voice breaking the mic. And Danielle were never forced to confess in court, but during their testimony, the courtroom was completely silence was the weight of truth rather than the weight of legal requirements. Sometimes the only thing we need to do is not reach out, and even those closest to us can silently disappear from our life, just like they did when they first appeared on the screen. The silent companion at the heart of the story, Fritz Storm, the first thing that comes to mind when someone thinks about American Pickers. Millions of viewers' thoughts aren't limited to the vintage vehicles laden with Frank. Fritz is an example of an antique's personality with a dry sense of humor and disarming bluntness. Frank lacked Mike's sophistication and flamboyance. Danielle, but it was his straightforwardness and friendliness that won her heart, so when Frank abruptly